This is a reproduction of Durer's famous Rhinoceros woodcut made in 1515. He made this detailed image from a written description and a small sketch given to him by an unknown artist who had seen the rhino in Lisbon in the same year. This rhinoceros was an Indian rhinoceros, and Durer has decorated the exaggerated folds of skin like medieval armour. The earliest known printed image of a rhino was also made in 1515 by Giovanni Giacomo Penni and published in Rome to accompany a poem. The other materials I have looked at are printed images in the form of cigarette cards, stamps and banknotes. In many cases these were more accessible to the general public before extensive photographical documentation and the development of zoos in Europe. I like the idea of learning about animals through the collecting of cards and stamps, even though some of them started off as images to promote cigarette companies. The intricate engraving and print quality of postage stamps and banknote production is very attractive to artists working in the printmaking mediums. Another aspect of my research looked at an ongoing conservation project using drones and thermal imaging cameras to track and map the animals. The colour interpretation is particularly interesting. I made some initial sketchbook drawings in the rain on my first drive around the safari park and added to these when meeting the keepers. The next stage was to make some preliminary drawings and watercolours exploring possible colour combinations and compositions. Layering watercolour is similar to the way ink can be built up to make a printed image. I decided to construct the image in a grid format. Each square of the grid will be a woodblock. Hopefully this will add the element of mapping and a scientific structure to the final print. The composition is first drawn out in line, and I have given the edges of the image a perforated pattern like the stamps in my research. This final image is then built up using watercolour. The final watercolour study is to scale, and I will keep developing this right up to the colour printing stage. I'm looking at the potential to introduce text, sightlines and frame edges evident in the thermal image photographs. These may be added later. These are the wood blocks I'm going to use to make the print. There are 30 square blocks which assemble to make a rectangle. The image of the rhino will then be painted onto these before cutting each block. Underneath is a slightly larger block which will be used to print background colours. The blocks will be eventually printed in this format on the registration table. Using the preliminary watercolour and drawings for reference, the image is now drawn onto the 30 woodblocks using charcoal. This is then reinforced with poster paint and washers, and at this point I have introduced the Latin name for the white rhinoceros. Each of the 30 blocks is now cut out using the painted image as a guide. The cutting involves removing the surface veneer of wood to varying degrees. The unpainted areas are totally removed, the grey areas are half cut out, and the black areas are left uncut. There is plenty of potential for introducing different textures and patterns by cutting the surface in different ways. This part of the project is probably the most time-consuming, but interesting as it is a way of redrawing the image in this new medium of wood, which will lend its own quality as it is cut and shaped. This shows the top row of blocks with the cutting completed. Each of the 30 blocks is now cut out using the painted image as a guide. The cutting involves removing the surface veneer of wood to varying degrees. The unpainted areas are totally removed, the grey areas are half cut out, and the black areas are left uncut. There is plenty of potential for introducing different textures and patterns by cutting the surfaces in different ways. This part of the project is probably the most time-consuming, but interesting, as it is a way of redrawing the image in this new medium of wood, which will lend its own quality as it is cut and shaped. I use a Stanley knife for most of the cutting, and occasionally handheld woodcut tools and steel points. The idea is to translate the painting on the surface of the wood into marks, textures and lines. By cutting into the top surface, any uncut areas will hold the ink when rolled up. A point can be used to punch holes which will print as blank dots. Much of the cutting of this image has been done following the grain of the wood in lines to suggest a finely engraved surface, like an old television screen image, trying to emulate the idea of a recorded video image, combined with the more traditional printing qualities of engraved banknotes and stamps. As each wood block is cut, I lined up the adjacent blocks so that the cut areas matched and maintained continuity. When they were all cut and assembled, some further cutting was done to introduce a pattern to part of the background area. When all the cutting is complete, you get an idea of what the image is going to look like, remembering that it will be the other way round when printed. The blocks are now carefully checked for alignment. When each of the 30 wood blocks with the image on them are cut out, they are inked up and assembled in order on the registration table. The table has dowel pegs along the top side, and the printing paper will eventually have holes punched in it to fit over these. Hanging from the ceiling above the table is a bulldog clip on an adjustable length of string, enabling the front of the paper to be suspended above the inked blocks. A coloured ink has been mixed, in this case a medium-toned blue. This is as near as possible to what the final colour of the overprint will be when the blocks are printed onto the background colours created by a second woodblock. The acetate is placed carefully onto the inked blocks. Unlike the printing paper, it does not need to be fitted over the dowels, but it is burnished with a spoon in the same way as the eventual prints will be printed. The spoon presses the acetate onto the inked areas, and the ink then transfers onto the underside of the sheet, creating a transparent map of the image. When it is dry, the acetate print will be used as an overlay to guide the printing of the second woodblock. This second block will be reduction printed to create a background of coloured areas. The acetate sheet is carefully lifted off and put aside to dry. The woodblocks are then cleaned and won't be used until all the background colours are printed. A second woodblock, the same size, is used to print the background colours. I have cut out serrations around the border and will print the whole block in a very pale blue. The block is rolled with ink and placed on a registration table with the paper suspended above it. The top side of the paper has holes in it which correspond with dowel pegs to keep it in place. The front edge can now be clipped into a suspended clip so the inked block can be placed on the frame without any contact with the paper. When the inked block is in place, the paper is unclipped and lowered onto the ink. The back of the paper is now burnished with a spoon until all the ink from the block is transferred onto the paper. When the burnishing is finished, the print is lifted off the block and put aside to dry. I blot each print with newspaper to keep the ink layers thin. This process is repeated with each print in the edition. The background colours are very pale to start with, and they get progressively darker in tone with each printing. This print is only in an edition of 4, so this has to be done 4 times for each colour. After each background colour is printed, the acetate overlay is placed on a dry print, and using tracing paper, areas can be traced. These are then retraced onto the second block using carbon paper. When each traced area is cut out of the second block, it is re-inked in another colour and printed over each of the prints in the edition, building up a background of coloured areas which correspond to the image on the first block. This detail shows the first 3 background colours. This process of tracing and cutting is repeated until all the background colours are complete. As more and more areas are cut out, isolated areas of uncut block can be inked up with smaller rollers so that more than one colour at a time can be printed. Each time the traced areas on the second block are cut, it is possible to introduce more pattern and texture in the method of cutting. This will then interact with the previous colours and finally the overprinted image. The ink does pick up on some cut out areas, and this gives interesting overlays and coloured textures. These are the last 2 background colours being printed. All the rest of the second block except these inked areas has now been cut out. This kind of printmaking is quite methodical. If you invest time and care with the drawn image, there are opportunities to adjust and add changes along the way, especially with the background colours. Because of the time it takes to cut the blocks and print each background colour in turn, there is room to make minor adjustments and careful decisions throughout the procedure. The last colours are usually the darkest in tone, but they have to be lighter than the final overprinted colour. This shows all the background colours completed and ready for the final overprinting stage. When all the background colours are printed and correspond to the acetate overlay, the original 30 woodblocks with the drawn image on are re-inked and assembled on the registration table. All the colours used have been recorded on a strip of paper. The final colour has to be dark enough to establish a strong image, but also a colour that will unite all the colours underneath. This is a carefully considered choice and involves making colour swatches and comparing them with the previous colours. There will be quite a lot of white in this final colour mix to lighten the tone, although it may look very dark from a distance. To keep all the blocks in place, I decided to glue them to a card background. This eliminates minor wobbles and movement, which could cause a blurry image. The last part of the print process, in this case, is the culmination of a month's work. The addition of 4 prints with their background colours are all the same, but there are no spares and therefore no room for any mistakes. Each overprint has to be well printed and identical as far as humanly possible. The hand printing process, burnishing with a spoon, allows me to lift up the print from one side to check that all the ink has been lifted off the blocks before removing it completely. The blocks are re-inked for each of the 4 prints, and each print is dried flat for a week before framing. The finished print is a result of an attempt to combine some of the scientific imaging being explored with thermal cameras and the historical animal illustrations, which started with the famous Durer's woodcut of a rhinoceros. I opted to present this in a commemorative stamp format with the Latin name and actual name of the rhinoceros and year date to establish the print made at this particular time of the 21st century.